On the Will and Nature. By Arthur Schopenhauer, translated by Madame Karl Hillebrand. I spun on the loom of time my web. They held it to be not worth looking at. Yet everything makes progress openly in time. Aeschylus, Prometheus. Preface to the second edition. To my great joy I have lived to revise even this little work, after a lapse of 19 years, and that joy is enhanced by the special importance of this treatise for my philosophy. For, starting from the purely empirical, from the observations of unbiased physical investigators, themselves following the clue of their own special sciences, I here immediately arrive at the very kernel of my metaphysics. I establish its points of contact with the physical sciences and thus corroborate my fundamental dogma, in a sense, as the arithmetician proves a sum. For by this I not only confirm it more closely and specially, but even make it more clearly, easily, and rightly understood than anywhere else. The improvements in this new edition are confined almost entirely to the additions, for scarcely anything that is worth mentioning in the first edition has been left out, while I have inserted many and, in some cases, important new passages. But even in a general sense, it may be looked upon as a good sign that a new edition of the present treatise should have been found necessary, since it shows that there is an interest in serious philosophy and confirms the fact that the necessity for real progress in this direction is now more strongly felt than ever. This is based upon two circumstances. The first is the unparalleled zeal and activity displayed in every branch of natural science which, as this pursuit is mostly in the hands of people who have learned nothing else, threatens to lead to a gross, stupid materialism, the more immediately offensive side of which is less the moral bestiality of its ultimate results, than the incredible absurdity of its first principles, for by it even vital force is denied, and organic nature is degraded to a mere chance play of chemical forces. These knights of the crucible and retort should be made to understand that the mere study of chemistry qualifies a man to become an apothecary, but not a philosopher. Certain other like-minded investigators of nature too must be taught that a man may be an accomplished zoologist and have the 60 species of monkeys at his fingers' ends, yet on the whole be an ignoramus to be classed with the vulgar, if he has learnt nothing else, save perhaps his school catechism. But in our time this frequently happens. Men set themselves up for enlighteners of mankind who have studied chemistry or physics or mineralogy and nothing else under the sun. To this they add their only knowledge of any other kind, that is to say, the little they may remember of the doctrines of the school catechism, and when they find that these two elements will not harmonize, they straightway turn scoffers at religion and soon become shallow and absurd materialists. They may perhaps have heard at college of the existence of a Plato and an Aristotle, of a Locke and especially of a Kant. But as these folk never handled crucibles and retorts or even stuffed a monkey, they do not esteem them worthy of further acquaintance. They prefer calmly to toss out of the window the intellectual labor of 2,000 years and treat the public to a philosophy concocted out of their own rich mental resources, on the basis of the catechism on the one hand, and on that of crucibles and retorts or the catalogue of monkeys on the other. They ought to be told in plain language that they are ignoramuses, who have much to learn before they can be allowed to have any voice in the matter. Everyone, in fact, who dogmatizes at random with the naive realism of a child on such arguments as God, the soul, the world's origin, atoms, and see, as if the critique of pure reason had been written on the moon and no copy had found its way to our planet, is simply one of the vulgar. Send him into the servants' hall, where his wisdom will best find a market. The other circumstance which calls for a real progress in philosophy is the steady growth of unbelief in the face of all the hypocritical dissembling and the outward conformity to the Church. This unbelief necessarily and unavoidably goes hand in hand with the growing expansion of empirical and historical knowledge. It threatens to destroy not only the form but even the spirit of Christianity, a spirit which has a much wider reach than Christianity itself, and to deliver up mankind to moral materialism, a thing even more dangerous than the chemical materialism already mentioned. And nothing plays more into the hands of this unbelief than the Tartuffianism de rigueur impudently flaunting itself everywhere just now, whose clumsy disciples, fee in hand, hold forth with such unction and emphasis, that their voices penetrate even into learned, critical reviews issued by academies and universities, and into physiological as well as philosophical books, where however, being quite in their wrong place, they only damage their own cause by rousing indignation. Under such circumstances as these, it is gratifying to see the public betray an interest in philosophy. I have nevertheless one sad piece of news to communicate to our professors of philosophy. Their Caspar Hauser, according to Dorgith, whom they had so carefully secreted, so securely walled up for nearly 40 years, that no sound could betray his existence to the world, their Caspar Hauser, I say, has escaped. He has escaped and is running about in the world. Some even say he is a prince. In plain language, the misfortune they feared more than anything has come to pass after all. In spite of their having done their best to prevent it for more than a generation by acting with united force, with rare constancy, secreting and ignoring to a degree that is without example, my books are beginning and henceforth will continue to be read. Leger et leger, there is no help for it. This is really dreadful and most inopportune. Nay, it is a positive fatality, not to say calamity. Is this the recompense for all their faithful, snug secrecy, for having held so firmly and unitedly together? Poor time-servers. What becomes of Horace's assurance? There is a sure reward too for trusty silence. For verily they have not been deficient in faithful reticence, rather do they excel in this quality wherever they scent merit. And after all, it is no doubt the cleverest artifice, for what no one knows, is as though it did not exist. Whether the reward will remain quite so certain, seems rather doubtful, unless we are to take mercies in a bad sense, and for this the support of many a classical authority might certainly be found. These gentlemen had seen quite rightly that the only means to be used against my writings was to secrete them from the public by maintaining profound silence concerning them, while they kept up a loud noise at the birth of every misshapen offspring of professorial philosophy, as the voice of the newborn Zeus was drowned in days of yore by the clashing of the cymbals of the caravans. But this expedient is now used up, the secret is out, the public has discovered me. The rage of our professors of philosophy at this is great but powerless, for their only effective resource so long successfully employed, being exhausted, no snarling can avail any longer against my influence, and in vain do they now take this or that or the other attitude. They have certainly succeeded, so far as the generation which was properly speaking contemporaneous with my philosophy, went to the grave in ignorance of it. But this was a mere postponement, and time has kept its word as it always does. Now there are two reasons why these gentlemen in the philosophical trade, as they call themselves with incredible naivete, hate my philosophy. The first of them is, that my writings spoil the taste of the public for tissues of empty phrases, for accumulations of unmeaning words piled one upon another, for hollow, superficial, brain-racking twaddle, for Christian dogmatics under the disguise of the most wearisome metaphysics, for systematized philistinism of the flattest kind made to represent ethics and even accompanied by instructions for card-playing and dancing. In short, they unfit my readers for the whole method of petticoat philosophizing à la vieille femme, which has scared so many forever from the pursuit of philosophy. The second reason is that our gentlemen in the trade are absolutely bound in conscience not to let my philosophy pass and are therefore debarred from using it for the benefit of the trade, and this they even heartily regret, for my abundance might have been admirably turned to account for the benefit of their own needy poverty. But even if it contained the greatest hoards of human wisdom ever unearthed, my doctrine could never find favor with them either now or in the future, for it is absolutely wanting in all speculative theology and rational psychology, and these, just these, are the very breath of life to these gentlemen, the sine qua non of their existence. For they are anxious before all things in heaven and on earth, to hold their official appointments, and these appointments demand before all things in heaven and on earth a speculative theology and a rational psychology. Extra haec non datur solus. Apart from these no salvation can be found. Theology there must and shall be, no matter whence it come. Moses and the prophets must be made out to be in the right. This is the highest principle in philosophy, and there must be rational psychology to boot as is proper. Now there is nothing of the sort to be found either in Kant's philosophy or in mine. For, as we all know, the most cogent theological argumentation shivers to atoms like a glass thrown at a wall, when it is brought into contact with Kant's critique of all speculative theology, and under his hands not a shred remains entire of the whole tissue of rational psychology. As to myself, being the bold continuer of Kant's philosophy, I have entirely done away with all speculative theology and all rational psychology, as is only consistent and honest. On the other hand, the task incumbent upon university philosophy is at bottom this: to set forth the chief fundamental truths belonging to the catechism under the veil of some very abstract, abstruse and difficult, therefore painfully wearisome formulas and sentences. Wherefore, however confused, intricate, strange and eccentric the matter may seem at first sight, these truths invariably reveal themselves as its kernel. This proceeding may be useful, though to me it is unknown. All I know is that philosophy, i.e. the search after truth, I mean the truth above all others, by which the most sublime and important disclosures, more precious than anything else to the human race, are understood, will never advance a step, nay an inch, by means of such maneuvering, by which its course is on the contrary impeded. Therefore I found out long ago that university philosophy is the enemy of all genuine philosophy. Now, this being the state of the case, when a really honest philosophy arises, which seriously has truth for its sole aim, must not these gentlemen of the philosophical trade feel as might stage knights in pasteboard armor, were a knight suddenly to appear in the midst of them clad in real armor, who made the stage floor creak under his ponderous tread? Such philosophy as this must therefore be bad and false, and consequently places these gentlemen of the trade under the painful obligation of playing the part of him who, in order to appear what he is not, cannot allow others to pass for what they really are. Out of all this, however, there unrolls itself the amusing spectacle we enjoy, when these gentlemen, now that ignoring has unfortunately come to an end after 40 years, at last begin to measure me by their own puny standard and pass judgment upon me from the heights of their wisdom, as though they were amply qualified to do so by their office. But they are most amusing of all when they assume airs of superiority towards me. Their abhorrence of Kant, though less openly expressed, is scarcely less great than their hatred of me, precisely because all speculative theology and all rational psychology, the breadwinners of these gentlemen, have been undermined, not to say irrevocably ruined, by him in the eyes of all serious thinkers. What? Not hate him? Him who has made their trade in philosophy so difficult to them, that they hardly see how to pull through honorably. So Kant and I are accordingly both bad, and these gentlemen quite overlook us. For nearly 40 years they have not deigned to cast a glance upon me, and now they look down condescendingly upon Kant from the heights of their wisdom, smiling in pity at his errors. This policy is both very wise and very profitable, since they are thus able to hold forth at their ease volume after volume upon God and the soul, as if these were personalities with whom they were intimately acquainted, and to discourse upon the relation in which the former stands to the world and the latter to the body, just as if there had never been such a thing as a critique of pure reason. When once the critique of pure reason is done away with, all will go on splendidly. Now it is for this end that they have been endeavoring for many years quietly and gradually to set Kant aside, to make him obsolete, nay, to turn up their noses at him, and one being encouraged by the other in this, they are becoming bolder every day. They have no opposition to fear from their own colleagues, since they all have the same aims and the same mission, and all together form a numerous coterie, the brilliant members of which, coram populo in public, bow and scrape to each other on all sides. Thus by degrees things have come to such a point, that the wretchedest compilers of manuals have the presumption to treat Kant's grand immortal discoveries as antiquated errors, nay, calmly to set them aside with the most ludicrous arrogance and most impudent dicta of their own, which they nevertheless lay down under the disguise of argumentation, because they know they may count upon a credulous public, to whom Kant's writings are not known. And this is what happens to Kant on the part of writers, whose total incapacity strikes us in every page, not to say every line, we read of their unmeaning, stupefying verbiage. Were this to go on much longer, Kant would present the spectacle of the dead lion being kicked by the donkey. Even in France there is no lack of fellow workers inspired by a similar orthodoxy, who are laboring towards the same end. A certain M. Barthélemy de Saint-Hilaire, for instance, in a lecture delivered in the Académie des Sciences Morales in April 1850, has presumed to criticize Kant with an air of condescension and to use most improper language in speaking of him. Luckily, however, in such a way that no one could fail to see the underlying purpose. Now others among our German philosophical trade again try to get rid of the obnoxious Kant in a different way. Instead of attacking his philosophy point blank, they rather seek to undermine the foundations on which it is built. These people, however, are so utterly forsaken by all the gods and by all power of judgment, that they attack a priori truths. That is to say, truths as old as the human understanding, nay, which constitute that understanding itself, and which it is therefore impossible to contradict without declaring war against that understanding also. So great, however, is the courage of these gentlemen. I am sorry to say I know of 3, and I am afraid there are a good many more at work at this undermining process, who have the incredible presumption to maintain the a posteriori origin of space as a consequence, a mere relation, of the objects within it. For they assert that space and time are of empirical origin and attached to those bodies, so that, according to them, space first arises through our perception of the juxtaposition of bodies, and time likewise through our perception of the succession of changes, sanctus implicitus. As if the words collateral and successive would have any sense for us without the antecedent intuitions of space and of time to give them a meaning. Consequently, that if there were no bodies there would be no space, therefore if they disappeared space also must lapse, and that if all changes were to stop, time also would stop. And such stuff as this is gravely taught 50 years after Kant's death. The aim of it is, as we know, to undermine Kantian philosophy, and certainly if these propositions were true, one stroke would suffice to overthrow it. Fortunately, however, these assertions are of a kind which is met by derision rather than by serious refutation. For, in them, the question is one of heresy, not so much against Kantian philosophy as against common sense, and they are not so much an attack upon any particular philosophical dogma, as upon an a priori truth which, as such, constitutes human understanding itself, and therefore must be instantaneously evident to everyone who is in his senses, just as much as that 2 times 2 is equal to 4. Fetch me a peasant from the plough, make the question intelligible to him, and he will tell you that even if all things in heaven and on earth were to vanish, space would nevertheless remain, and that if all changes in heaven and on earth were to cease, time would nevertheless flow on. Compared with German pseudo-philosophers like these, how estimable does a man like the French physicist Pouillet appear, who, though he never troubles his head about metaphysics, is careful to incorporate 2 long paragraphs, one on le space, the other on le temps, in the first chapter of his well-known manual, on which public instruction in France is based, where he shows that if all matter were annihilated, space would still remain, and that space is infinite, and that if all changes ceased, time would still pursue its course without end. Now here he does not appeal, as in all other cases, to experience, because in this case experience is not possible, yet he speaks with apodictic certainty. For, as a physicist, professing a science which is absolutely immanent, i.e. limited to the reality that is empirically given, it never comes into his head to inquire whence he knows all this. It did come into Kant's head, and it was this very problem, clothed by him in the severe form of an inquiry as to the possibility of synthetical a priori judgments, that became the starting point and the cornerstone of his immortal discoveries, or in other words, of transcendental philosophy which, precisely by answering this question and others related to it, shows what is the nature of that empirical reality itself. And 70 years after the Critique of Pure Reason had appeared and filled the world with its fame, these gentlemen dare to serve up such gross absurdities, which were done away with long ago, and to return to former barbarism. If Kant were to come back and see all this mischief, he would feel like Moses on returning from Mount Sinai, when he found his people worshipping the golden calf, and dashed the tables to pieces in his anger. But if Kant were to take things as tragically as Moses, I should console him with the words of Jesus ben Sirach. He that telleth a tale to a fool speaketh to one in a slumber. When the tale hath been told, he will say, What is the matter? For that diamond in Kant's crown, transcendental aesthetic, never has existed for these gentlemen. It is tacitly set aside as non-avenue, not having occurred. I wonder what they think nature means by producing the rarest of all her works, a great mind, one among so many hundreds of millions, if the worshipful company of numbskulls are to be able at their pleasure and by their mere counter-assertion to annul the weightiest doctrines emanating from that mind, let alone to treat them with disregard and do as if they did not exist. But this degenerate, barbarous state of philosophy which, in the present day, emboldens every tyro to hold forth at random upon subjects that have puzzled the greatest minds, is precisely a consequence still remaining of the impunity with which, thanks to the connivance of our professors of philosophy, that audacious scribbler, Hegel, has been allowed to flood the market with his monstrous vagaries and so to pass for the greatest of all philosophers for the last 30 years in Germany. Every one, of course, now thinks himself entitled to serve up confidently anything that may happen to come into his sparrow's brain. Therefore, as I have said, the gentlemen of the philosophical trade are anxious above all to obliterate Kant's philosophy in order to be able to return to the muddy canal of the old dogmatism and to talk at random to their heart's content upon the favorite subjects which are specially recommended to them, just as if nothing had happened and neither a Kant nor a critical philosophy had ever come into the world. The affected veneration for and laudation of Leibniz too, which has been showing itself everywhere for some years, proceed from the same source. They like to place him in a line with, nay above, Kant, having at times the assurance to call him the greatest of all German philosophers. Now, compared with Kant, Leibniz is a poor rushlight. Kant is a mastermind, to whom mankind is indebted for the discovery of never-to-be-forgotten truths. One of his chief merits is precisely, to have delivered us from Leibniz and his humbug, from pre-established harmonies, monads and identitas indiscernibilium, identity of indiscernibles. Kant has made philosophy serious and I am keeping it so. That these gentlemen should think differently is easily explained. Indeed, has not Leibniz a central monad and a theodicy, also with which to deck it out? Now this is quite to the taste of my gentlemen of the philosophical trade. It does not stand in the way of earning an honest livelihood. It allows one to subsist, whereas such a thing as Kant's critique of all speculative theology makes one's hair stand on end. Kant is consequently a wrong-headed man and one to be set aside. Vivat Leibniz. Vivat the philosophical trade. Vivat old women's philosophy. These gentlemen really imagine that, according to the standard of their own petty aims, they can obscure what is good, disparage what is great, and accredit what is false. They may perhaps succeed in doing so for a time, but certainly not in the long run, nor with impunity. Notwithstanding all their machinations and spiteful ignoring of me for 40 years, have not even I at last made my way? During those 40 years, however, I have learnt to appreciate Chamfort's words. When we see the league of blockheads against intelligent men, we think we are witnessing a conspiracy of servants to overthrow their masters. We do not care to have much to do with those whom we dislike. One of the consequences of this antipathy for Kant, therefore, has been an incredible ignorance of his doctrines. I can scarcely believe my eyes at times, when I see certain proofs of this ignorance, and must here support my assertion by a few examples. First, let me present a very singular specimen, though it is now some years old. In Professor Michelet's Anthropology and Psychology, page 444, he states Kant's categorical imperative in the following words: "Thou must, for thou canst, do sollst, denn du kannst." This cannot be a lapsus calami, for he again states it in the same words in his History of the Development of Modern German Philosophy, page 38, published 3 years later. Letting alone the fact that he appears to have studied Kantian philosophy in Schiller's epigrams, he has thus turned the thing upside down, and expressed exactly the opposite of Kant's argument, evidently without having the slightest inkling of what Kant meant by that postulate of freedom on the basis of his categorical imperative. None of Professor Michelet's colleagues, to my knowledge, have pointed out this mistake, but hanc veniam damus petimusc vicissum. We beg this freedom for ourselves and likewise grant it to others. Another more recent instance. The above-mentioned reviewer of Oersted's book, see Note 1c, page 202, to whose title the present treatise unfortunately had to stand godfather, comes in that work on the sentence that bodies are spaces filled with force, Krafterfüllt Raum. This is new to him, so without the faintest suspicion that he has to do with a far-famed Kantian dogma, and taking this for a paradoxical opinion of Oersted's, he attacks it and argues against it bravely, persistently and repeatedly in both his reviews, which appeared at an interval of 3 years from one another, using arguments like these: force cannot fill space without something substantial, matter. Then again 3 years later, force in space does not yet constitute anything. For force to fill space there must be substance, matter. A mere force can never fill. Matter must be there for it to fill. Bravo! My cobbler would use just such arguments as these. When I see specimina eruditionis of this sort, I begin to have my misgivings whether I did not do the man injustice by naming him among those who endeavor to undermine Kant. But in this, to be sure, I had in view his assertions that space is but the relation, the juxtaposition of things, and that space is a relation in which things stand, a juxtaposition of things. This juxtaposition ceases to be a conception as soon as the conception of matter ceases. For he might possibly have penned these sentences in sheer innocence, since he may have known no more of the transcendental aesthetic than of the metaphysical first principles of natural science. Though to be sure, this would be rather extraordinary for a professor of philosophy. Nowadays, however, we must not be surprised at anything. For all knowledge of critical philosophy has died out, in spite of its being the latest true philosophy that has appeared, and a doctrine withal, that has made a revolution and epoch in human knowledge and thought. Now therefore, since it has overthrown all previous systems, and since the knowledge of it has died out, philosophizing no longer proceeds on the basis of any of the doctrines propounded by the great minds of the past, but becomes a mere random untutored process, having an ordinary education and the catechism for its foundation. Now that I have startled them, however, our professors may perhaps take to studying Kant's works again. Still, Lichtenberg says, past a certain age, I think it as impossible to learn Kantian philosophy as to learn rope dancing. I should certainly not have condescended to record the sins of these sinners had not the interests of truth required that I should do so, in order to show the state of degradation at which German philosophy has arrived 50 years after Kant's death in consequence of the machinations of the gentlemen of the trade, and also to show what would result if these puny minds, who know nothing but their own ends, were to be suffered without hindrance to check the influence of the great geniuses who have illumined the world. I cannot look on at this in silence. It is rather a case to which Goethe's exhortation applies. Be not so silent, you who are strong, even if others are shy. Whoever wants to scare the devil must cry out aloud. Dr. Martin Luther thought so also. Hatred against Kant, hatred against me, hatred against truth, all however in majorum Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God, is what inspires these worthies who live on philosophy. Who can be so blind as not to see that university philosophy is the enemy of all true, serious philosophy whose progress it feels bound to withstand. For a philosophy which deserves the name is pure service of truth, therefore the most sublime of all human endeavors. But as such, it is not adapted for a trade. Least of all can it have its seat in universities, where a theological faculty predominates and things are irrevocably decided beforehand ere philosophy comes to them. With scholasticism, from which university philosophy descends, it was quite a different thing. Scholasticism was avowedly the ancilla theologiae, handmaid to theology, so that here the name corresponded to the thing. Our university philosophy of today, on the contrary, disclaims the connection and professes independent research. Yet in reality it is only the ancilla disguised, and it is intended no less than its predecessor to be the servant of theology. Thus genuine, sincerely meant philosophy has an adversary under the guise of an ally in university philosophy. Therefore I said long ago, that nothing would be of greater benefit to philosophy than for it to cease altogether to be taught at universities, and if at that time I still admitted the propriety of a brief, quite succinct course of history of philosophy accompanying logic, which undoubtedly ought to be taught at universities, I have since withdrawn that hasty concession in consequence of the following disclosure made to us in the Göttingischen Gelehrtenanzeigen of the January 1, 1853, page 8, by the Ordinarius Loci, ecclesiastic of the place. One who writes history of philosophy in thick volumes, it could not be mistaken that Kant's doctrine is ordinary theism, and that it has contributed little or nothing towards transforming the current views on God and his relation to the world. If this is the state of the case, universities are in my opinion no longer the right place even for teaching history of philosophy. Their designs and intentions reign paramount. I had indeed long ago begun to suspect that history of philosophy was taught at our universities in the same spirit and with the same granum salis, grain of salt, as philosophy itself, and it needed but very little to make my suspicions certainty. Accordingly it is my wish to see both philosophy and its history disappear from the lecture list, because I desire to rescue them from the tender mercies of our court counselors. But far be it from me to wish to see our professors of philosophy removed from their thriving business at our universities. On the contrary, what I should like would be to see them promoted 3 degrees higher in dignity and raised to the highest faculty as professors of theology. For at the bottom they have really been this for some time already, and have served quite long enough as volunteers. Meanwhile my honest and kindly advice to the young generation is not to waste any time with university philosophy but to study Kant's works and my own instead. I promise them that there they will learn something substantial that will bring light and order into their brains, so far at least as they may be capable of receiving them. It is not good to crowd round a wretched farthing rushlight when brilliant torches are close by, still less to run after will-o'-the-wisps. Above all, my truth-seeking young friends, beware of letting our professors tell you what is contained in the Critique of Pure Reason. Read it yourselves and you will find in it something very different from what they deem it advisable for you to know. In our time a great deal too much study is generally devoted to the history of philosophy, for this study, being adapted by its very nature to substitute knowledge for reflection, is just now cultivated downright with a view to making philosophy consist in its own history. It is not only of doubtful necessity, but even of questionable profit, to acquire a superficial half-knowledge of the opinions and systems of all the philosophers who have taught for 2,500 years. Yet what more does the most honest history of philosophy give? A real knowledge of philosophers can only be acquired from their own works, and not from the distorted image of their doctrines as it is found in the commonplace head. But it is really urgent that order should be brought into our heads by some sort of philosophy, and that we should at the same time learn to look at the world with a really unbiased eye. Now no philosophy is so near to us, both as regards time and language as that of Kant, and it is at the same time a philosophy, compared with which all those which went before are superficial. On this account it is unhesitatingly to be preferred to all others. But I perceive that the news of Caspar Hauser's escape has already spread among our professors of philosophy, for I see that some of them have already given vent to their feelings in bitter and venomous abuse of me in various periodicals, making up by falsehoods for their deficiency of wit. Nevertheless I do not complain of all this, because I am rejoiced at the cause and amused by the effect of it, as illustrative of Goethe's verse. The little dog from our stall will always come with us, yet the loudness of his barking just shows that we are riding. Arthur Schopenhauer. Frankfurt am Main, August 1854. Introduction. I break silence after 17 years, in order to point out, to the few who are in advance of the age and may have given their attention to my philosophy, sundry corroborations which have been contributed to it by unbiased empiricists who are unacquainted with my writings, and who, in pursuing their own road in search of merely empirical knowledge, discovered at its extreme end what my doctrine has propounded as the metaphysical, das Metaphysische, from which the explanation of experience as a whole must come. This circumstance is the more encouraging, as it confers upon my system a distinction over all hitherto existing ones, for all the other systems, even the latest, that of Kant, still leave a wide gap between their results and experience, and are far from coming down directly to and into contact with experience. By this my metaphysic proves itself to be the only one having an extreme point in common with the physical sciences, a point up to which these sciences come to meet it by their own paths, so as really to connect themselves and to harmonize with it. Moreover, this is not brought about by twisting and straining the empirical sciences in order to adapt them to metaphysic, nor by metaphysic having been secretly abstracted from them beforehand and then, a la Schelling, finding a priori what it had learnt a posteriori. On the contrary, both meet at the same point of their own accord, yet without collusion. My system therefore, far from soaring above all reality and all experience, descends to the firm ground of actuality, where its lessons are continued by the physical sciences. Now the extraneous and empirical corroborations I am about to bring forward, all concern the kernel and chief point of my doctrine, its metaphysic proper. They concern, that is, the paradoxical fundamental truth, that what Kant opposed as thing in itself to mere phenomenon, called more decidedly by me representation, and what he held to be absolutely unknowable, that this thing in itself, this substratum of all phenomena, and therefore of the whole of nature, is nothing but what we know directly and intimately and find within ourselves as the will, that accordingly, this will, far from being inseparable from, and even a mere result of knowledge, differs radically and entirely from, and is quite independent of knowledge, which is secondary and of later origin, and can consequently subsist and manifest itself without knowledge, a thing which actually takes place throughout the whole of nature from the animal kingdom downwards, that this will, being the one and only thing in itself, the sole truly real, primary, metaphysical thing in a world in which everything else is only phenomenon, i.e. mere representation, gives all things whatever they may be, the power to exist and to act, that accordingly not only the voluntary actions of animals but the organic mechanism, nay even the shape and quality of their living body, the vegetation of plants and finally, even in inorganic nature crystallization, and in general every primary force which manifests itself in physical and chemical phenomena, not excepting gravity, that all this, I say, in itself, i.e. independently of phenomenon, which only means independently of our brain and its representations, is absolutely identical with the will we find within us and know as intimately as we can know anything. That further, the individual manifestations of the will are set in motion by motives and beings gifted with an intellect, but no less by stimuli in the organic life of animals and of plants, and finally in all inorganic nature by causes in the narrowest sense of the word, these distinctions applying exclusively to phenomena, that, on the other hand, knowledge with its substratum, the intellect, is a merely secondary phenomenon, differing completely from the will, only accompanying its higher degrees of objectification and not essential to it, which, as it depends upon the manifestations of the will in the animal organism, is therefore physical, and not, like the will, metaphysical, that we are never able therefore to infer absence of will from absence of knowledge, for the will may be pointed out even in all phenomena of unconscious nature, whether in plants or in inorganic bodies. In short, that the will is not conditioned by knowledge as has hitherto been universally assumed, although knowledge is conditioned by the will. Now this fundamental truth, which even today sounds so like a paradox, is the part of my doctrine to which, in all its chief points, the empirical sciences, themselves ever eager to steer clear of all metaphysic, have contributed just as many confirmations forcibly elicited by the irresistible cogency of truth, but which are most surprising on account of the quarter whence they proceed, and although they have certainly come to light since the publication of my chief work, it has been quite independently of it as the years went on. Now, that it should be precisely this fundamental doctrine of mine which has thus met with confirmation, is advantageous in two respects. First, because it is the main thought upon which my system is founded. Secondly, because it is the only part of my philosophy that admits of confirmation through sciences which are alien to and independent of it. For although the last 17 years, during which I have been constantly occupied with this subject, have, it is true, brought me many corroborations as to other parts, such as ethics, aesthetics, dianoiology, still these, by their very nature, pass at once from the sphere of actuality, whence they arise, to that of philosophy itself. so they cannot claim to be extraneous evidence, nor can they, as collected by me, have the same irrefragable, unequivocal cogency as those concerning metaphysics proper which are given by its correlate physics, in the wide sense of the word which the ancients gave it. For, in pursuing its own road, physics, i.e. natural science as a whole, must in all its branches finally come to a point where physical explanation ceases. Now this is precisely the metaphysical, which natural science only apprehends as the impassable barrier at which it stops short and henceforth abandons its subject to metaphysics. Kant therefore was quite right in saying, "It is evident that the primary sources of nature's agency must absolutely belong to the sphere of metaphysics." Physical science is wont to designate this unknown, inaccessible something, at which its investigations stop short and which is taken for granted in all its explanations, by such terms as physical force, vital force, formative principle, and C, which in fact mean no more than X, Y, Z. Now if nevertheless, in single, propitious instances, specially acute and observant investigators succeed in casting, as it were, a furtive glance behind the curtain which bounds off the domain of natural science, and are able not only to feel that it is a barrier but, in a sense, to obtain a view of its nature and thus to peep into the metaphysical region beyond. If moreover, having acquired this privilege, they explicitly designate the limit thus explored as that which is stated to be the true inner essence and final principle of all things by a system of metaphysics unknown to them, which takes its reasons from a totally different sphere and, in every other respect, recognizes all things merely as phenomena, i.e. as representation, then indeed the two bodies of investigators must feel like two mining engineers digging a passageway who, having started from 2 points far apart and worked for some time in subterranean darkness, trusting exclusively to compass and spirit level, suddenly to their great joy catch the sound of each other's hammers. For now indeed these investigators know that the point so long vainly sought for has at last been reached at which metaphysics and physics meet, they who were as hard to bring together as heaven and earth, that a reconciliation has been initiated and a connection found between these two sciences. But the philosophical system which has witnessed this triumph receives by it the strongest and most satisfactory proof possible of its own truth and accuracy. Compared with such a confirmation as this, which may, in fact, be looked upon as equivalent to proving a sum in arithmetic, the regard or disregard of a given period of time loses all importance, especially when we consider what has been the subject of interest meanwhile and find it to be the sort of philosophy we have been treated to since Kant. The eyes of the public are gradually opening to the mystification by which it has been duped for the last 40 years under the name of philosophy, and this will be more and more the case. The day of reckoning is at hand, when it will see whether all this endless scribbling and quibbling since Kant has brought to light a single truth of any kind. I may thus be dispensed from the obligation of entering here into subjects so unworthy, the more so as I can accomplish my purpose more briefly and agreeably by narrating the following anecdote. During the carnival, Dante having lost himself in a crowd of masks, the Duke of Medici ordered him to be sought for. Those commissioned to look for him, being doubtful whether they would be able to find him as he was himself masked, the Duke gave them a question to put to every mask they might meet who resembled Dante. It was this: "Who knows what is good?" After receiving several foolish answers, they finally met with a mask who replied, "He that knows what is bad," by which Dante was immediately recognized. What is meant by this here is that I have seen no reason to be disheartened on account of the want of sympathy of my contemporaries, since I had at the same time before my eyes the objects of their sympathy. What those authors were, posterity will see by their works. What the contemporaries were, will be seen by the reception they gave to those works. My doctrine lays no claim whatever to the name philosophy of the present time, which was a competition among the amusing adepts of Hegel's mystification, but it certainly does claim the title of philosophy of time to come, that is, of a time when people will no longer content themselves with a mere jingle of words without meaning, with empty phrases and trivial parallelisms, but will exact real contents and serious disclosures from philosophy, while on the other hand they will exempt it from the unjust and preposterous obligation of paraphrasing the national religion for the time being. For it is an extremely absurd thing, says Kant, to expect to be enlightened by reason and yet to prescribe to her beforehand on which side she must incline. It is indeed sad to live in an age so degenerate, that it should be necessary to appeal to the authority of a great man to attest so obvious a truth. But it is absurd to expect marvels from a philosophy that is chained up, and particularly amusing to watch the solemn gravity with which it sets to work to accomplish great things, when we all know beforehand the short meaning of the long speech. However, the keen-sighted assert that under the cloak of philosophy they can mostly detect theology holding forth for the edification of students thirsting after truth, and instructing them after its own fashion. And this again reminds us forcibly of a certain favorite scene in Faust. Others, who think that they see still farther into the matter, maintain that what is thus disguised is neither theology nor philosophy, but simply a poor devil who, while solemnly protesting that he has lofty, sublime truth for his aim, is in fact only striving to get bread for himself and for his future young family. This he might no doubt obtain by other means with less labor and more dignity. Meanwhile, however, for this price he is ready to do anything he is asked to do, even to deduce a priori, nay, should it come to the worst, to perceive the devil and his dam, by intellectual intuition. And here indeed the exceedingly comical effect is brought to a climax by the contrast between the sublimity of the ostensible, and the lowliness of the real aim. It remains nevertheless desirable, that the pure, sacred precincts of philosophy should be cleansed of all such traitors, as was the temple of Jerusalem in former times of the buyers and sellers. Biding such better times therefore, may our philosophical public bestow its attention and interest as it has done hitherto. May it continue as before, invariably naming ficta as an obligato accompaniment to, and in the same breath with Kant, that great mind, produced but once by nature, which has illumined its own depth, as if forsooth they were of the same kind, and this without a single voice being heard to exclaim in protest, Eta alpha kappa lambda kappa alpha pi theta eta kappa omicron. May Hegel's philosophy of absolute nonsense, 3/4 cash and 1/4 crazy fancies, continue to pass for unfathomable wisdom without anyone suggesting as an appropriate motto for his writings Shakespeare's words, such stuff as madman tongue and brain not, or as an emblematical vignette, the cuttlefish with its ink bag creating a cloud of darkness around it to prevent people from seeing what it is, with the device, Mea Caligen tutus. May each day bring us as hitherto new systems, adapted for university purposes, entirely made up of words and phrases and in a learned jargon besides, which allows people to talk whole days without saying anything, and may these delights never be disturbed by the Arabian proverb, I hear the clappering of the mill but I see no flour. For all this is in accordance with the age and must have its course. In all times some such thing occupies the contemporary public more or less noisily, then it dies off so completely, vanishes so entirely without leaving a trace behind, that the next generation no longer knows what it was. Truth can bide its time, for it has a long life before it. Whatever is genuine and seriously meant, is always slow to make its way and certainly attains its end almost miraculously, for on its first appearance it as a rule meets with a cool, if not ungracious, reception. And this for exactly the same reason that, when once it is fully recognized and has passed on to posterity, the immense majority of men take it on credit, in order to avoid compromising themselves, whereas the number of genuine appreciators remains nearly as small as it was at first. These few nevertheless suffice to make the truth respected, for they are themselves respected. And thus it is passed from hand to hand through centuries over the heads of the inept multitude, so hard is the existence of mankind's best inheritance. On the other hand, if truth had to crave permission to be true from such as have quite different aims at heart, its cause might indeed be given up for lost, for then it might often be dismissed with the witch's watchword, fair is foul and foul is fair. Luckily, however, this is not the case. Truth depends upon no one's favor or disfavor, nor does it ask anyone's leave. It stands upon its own feet and has time for its ally. Its power is irresistible, its life indestructible. Physiology and Pathology. In classifying the above-mentioned empirical corroborations of my doctrine according to the sciences from which they come, while I take the graduated order of nature from the highest to the lowest degree as a guiding thread to my expositions, I must first mention a very striking confirmation lately received by my chief dogma in the physiological and pathological views of Dr. Joachim Dietrich Brandes, private physician to the King of Denmark, a veteran in science, whose essay on vital force, 1795, had received Reel's hearty commendation. In his two latest writings, Experiences in the Application of Cold and Disease, Berlin 1833, and Nosology and Therapeutics of Cachexias 1834, we find him in the most emphatic and striking manner stating the primary source of all vital functions to be an unconscious will, from which he derives all processes in the machinery of the organism, in health as well as in disease, and which he represents as the primum mobile, first mover, of life. I must support this by literal quotations from these essays, since few save medical readers are likely to have them at hand. In the first of them, page 8, we find, the essence of every living organism consists in the will to maintain its own existence as much as possible over against the macrocosm, px. Only one living entity, one will, can be in an organ at the same time. Therefore, if there is a diseased will in disagreement with the rest of the body in the organ of the skin, we may hold it in check by applying cold as long as the generation of warmth, a normal will, can be induced by it. p. 1. If we are forced to the conviction that there must be a determining principle, a will, in every vital action by which the development suited to the whole organism is occasioned, and each metamorphosis of the parts conditioned, in harmony with the whole individuality, and likewise that there is a something capable of being determined and developed, and c. p. 11. With respect to individual life, the element which determines, the organic will, if it is to rest satisfied, must be able to attain what it wants from that which has to be determined. This occurs even when the vital movements are overexcited, as in inflammation. Something new is formed, the noxious element is expelled, new plastic materials are meanwhile conveyed through the arteries, more venous blood is carried off, until the process of inflammation is finished and the organic will satisfied. It is however possible to excite this will to such a degree as to make satisfaction impossible. This exciting cause or stimulus either acts directly upon the particular organ, poison, contagion, or it affects the whole life, and this life then begins to make the most strenuous efforts to rid itself of the noxious element or to modify the disposition of the organic will, and provokes critical vital activity in particular parts, inflammations, or yields to the unappeased will. p. 12. The insatiable will acts destructively upon the organism unless either the whole life in its efforts to attain unity, tendency to adapt means to end, produces other activities requiring satisfaction, crises et lysis, which hold that will in check, called decisive, crises completi, when quite successful, crises incomplete, when only partially so, or b. some other stimulus, medicine, produces another will which represses the diseased one. If we place this in one and the same category with the will of which we have become conscious through our own representations, and bear in mind that here there can be no question of more or less distant resemblance, we gain the conviction that we have grasped the fundamental conception of the one unlimited, therefore indivisible, life which, according to its different manifestations in various more or less endowed and exercised organs, is just as able to make hair grow on the human body as to combine the most sublime representations. We see that the most violent passion, unsatisfied will, may be checked by more or less strong excitement, and c. p. 18. The determining element, this organic will without representation, this tendency to preserve the organism as a unity, is induced by outward temperature to modify its activity now in the same, now in a remoter organ. Every manifestation of life, however, whether in health or in disease, is a manifestation of the organic will. This will determines vegetation, in a healthy condition in harmony with the unity of the whole, in an unhealthy one. It is induced not to will in harmony with that unity. p. 23. Cold suddenly applied to the skin suppresses its function, chill. Cold drinks check the organic will in the digestive organs and thereby intensify that of the skin and produce perspiration. Just so with the diseased organic will, cold checks cutaneous eruptions, and c. 33. Fever is the complete participation of the whole vital process in a diseased will, i.e. it is to the entire vital process what inflammation is to particular organs, the effort of our vitality to form something definite in order to content the diseased will and remove the noxious element. We call this process of formation crisis or lysis, turning point or release. The first perception of the pernicious element which causes the diseased will affects the individuality just in the same way as a noxious element apprehended by our senses, before we have brought to clear representation the entire relation in which it stands to our individuality and the means of removing it. It creates terror and its consequences, a standstill of the vital process in the parenchyma, especially in the parts directed towards the outer world, in the skin and in all the motor muscles belonging to the entire individuality, outer body shuddering, chills, trembling, pains in the limbs, and c. The difference between them is that in the latter case the noxious element either at once or gradually becomes clear representation, because it is compared with the individuality by means of all the senses, so that its relation to that individuality can be determined, and the means of protection against it, disregard, flight, warding off, defense, and c. be brought to a conscious will. Whereas in the former case we remain unconscious of that noxious element, and it is life alone, or nature's curative power, which is striving to remove the noxious element and thereby to content the diseased will. Nor must this be taken for a simile, it is, on the contrary, a true description of the manifestation of life. p. 58. We must however always bear in mind that cold acts here as a powerful stimulus to check or moderate the diseased will and to rouse in its place a natural will, accompanied by general warmth. In almost every page of this book similar expressions are to be found. In the second of the essays I have named, Brandis no longer combines the explanation by the will so universally with each separate analysis, probably in consideration that this explanation is properly speaking, a metaphysical one. Nevertheless he maintains it entirely and completely, giving it even all the more distinct and decided expression, wherever he states it. Thus, for instance in section 68 etc. He speaks of an unconscious will which cannot be separated from the conscious one, and is the primum mobile of all life as well in plants as in animals. For in these, it is a desire and aversion manifesting itself in all the organs which determines all their vital processes, secretions and c. Section 71. All convulsions prove that the manifestation of the will can take place without distinct power of representation. Section 72. Everywhere do we meet with a spontaneous, uncommunicated activity, now determined by the sublimest human free will, now by animal desire and aversion, now again by simple, more vegetative requirements, which activity in order to maintain itself, calls forth several other kinds of activity in the unity of the individual. p. 96. A creative, spontaneous, uncommunicated activity shows itself in every vital manifestation. The third factor in this individual creation is the will, the individual's life itself. The nerves are the conductors of this individual creation. By their means form and mixture are varied according to desire and aversion. p. 97. Assimilation of foreign substance makes the blood. It is not an absorption or an exudation of organic matter. On the contrary, here the sole factor of the phenomenon is in all cases the creative will, a life which cannot be brought back to any sort of imparted movement. When I wrote this, 1835, I was still naive enough seriously to believe that Brandis was unacquainted with my work, or I should not allude here to his writings, for they would then be merely a repetition, application and carrying out of my own doctrine on this point, not a corroboration of it. But I thought I might safely assume that he did not know me, because he has not mentioned me anywhere and because if he had known me, literary honesty would have made it his imperative duty not to remain silent concerning the man from whom he had borrowed his chief fundamental thought, the more so as he saw that man then enduring unmerited neglect, by his writings being generally ignored, a circumstance which might be construed as favorable to fraud. Add to this, that it lay in Brandis' own interest as a writer, and would therefore have shown sagacity on his part, to have appealed to me as an authority. For the fundamental doctrine propounded by him is so striking and paradoxical, that even his Göttingen reviewer is amazed and hardly knows what to think of it. Yet such a doctrine as this was left without foundation either through proof or induction, nor did Dr. Brandis establish its relation to the whole of our knowledge of nature. He simply asserted it. I imagine therefore that it was by the peculiar gift of divination, which enables eminent physicians to see and do the right thing in cases of illness, that he had been led to this view, without being able to give a strict and methodical account of the grounds of this really metaphysical truth, although he must have seen how greatly it is opposed to the generally received views. Had he, thought I, been acquainted with my philosophy, which gives far greater extension to this truth, makes it valid for the whole of nature and founds it both by proof and induction in close connection with Kant's teaching, from which it proceeds as a final result of excogitation, how gladly must he have availed himself of such confirmation and support, rather than to stand alone by an unheard of assertion which was never further carried out and, with him, never went beyond bare assertion. Such were the reasons that led me to believe myself entitled to take for granted Dr. Brandis' ignorance of my book. Since then, however, I have become better acquainted both with German scientists and Copenhagen academicians, to which body Dr. Brandis belonged, and have gained the conviction that he knew me very well indeed. I stated my reasons for arriving at this conviction already in 1844 in the second volume of Die Welt als Willende Vorstellung, L. So that, as the subject is by no means edifying, it is needless to repeat them here. I will merely add that I have since been assured on trustworthy authority that Dr. Brandis not only knew my work but even possessed it, as it was found among his property after his death. The unmerited obscurity to which writers like myself are long condemned, encourages such people to appropriate their thoughts without so much as naming them. Another medical authority has carried this even farther, for not content with the thought alone, he has appropriated to himself the expression of it also. I allude to Professor Anton Rosas of the University of Vienna, whose entire section 507 in the first volume of his textbook of ophthalmology 1830, is copied word for word from pages 14 to 16 of my treatise on Vision and Colors 1816, without any mention whatever of me, or even the slightest hint that he is using the words of another. This sufficiently accounts for the care he has taken not to mention my treatise among the lists of 21 writings on colors and 40 on the physiology of the eye, which he gives in sections 542 and 567, a caution which was however all the more advisable, as he had appropriated to himself a good deal more out of that pamphlet without mentioning me. All that is referred, for instance, in section 526 to 1, is only applicable to me. His entire section 527 is copied almost literally from my pages 59 and 60. The theory which he introduces without further ceremony in section 535 by the word evidently, that is, that yellow is 3/4 and violet 1/4 of the eye's activity, never was evident to anyone until I made it so. Even to this day it is a truth known to few and acknowledged by fewer still, and much is yet wanting. For example, that I should be dead and buried ere it be possible to call it evident without further ceremony. The matter will even have to wait till after my death to be seriously sifted, since a close investigation might easily bring to evidence the real difference between Newton's theory of colors and my own, which is simply that his is false and mine true, a discovery which could not fail to mortify my contemporaries. Wherefore, according to ancient custom, all serious examination into the question is wisely postponed for these few years. Professor Roses knew no such policy as this, and as the matter was not alluded to anywhere, thought himself entitled, like the Danish academician, to claim it as lawful prey, de bon prize, fair game. Evidently North and South German honesty had not yet come to a satisfactory understanding. Moreover, the whole contents of sections 538, 539 and 540 in Professor Rose's book are taken from my pamphlet, nay even in great part copied word for word from my section 13. Still once, where he stands in need of a voucher for a fact, he finds himself obliged to refer to my treatise. That is, in his section 531, and it is most amusing to see the way in which he even brings in the numerical fractions used by me, as a result of my theory, to express all colors. It had probably occurred to him that appropriating them quite sans facon, without more ado, might be a delicate matter, so he says, page 308, if we wish to express in numbers the first mentioned relation in which colors stand to white, assuming white to be equals 1, the following scale of proportion might by the way be adopted, as has already been done by Schopenhauer. Yellow equals 3/4, orange equals 2/3, red equals 1/2, green equals 1/2, blue equals 1/3, violet equals 1/4, black equals 0. Now I should like to know how anyone could do this by the way without having first thought out my whole color theory, to which alone these numbers refer, and apart from which they are mere abstract numbers without meaning. Above all, how anyone could do it who, like Professor Roses, professes to be a follower of Newton's color theory, with which these numbers are in direct contradiction. Finally, I should like to know how it came, that during the thousands of years in which men have thought and written, no one but myself and Professor Roses should ever have thought of using just these particular fractions to denote colors? For the words I have quoted above tell us that he would have stated those fractions precisely as he has done, even had I not chanced to do it already 14 years before and thus needlessly anticipated his statement. They also tell us that all that is required is to wish in order to do so. Now it is precisely in these numerical fractions that the secret of colors lies. By them alone can we rightly solve the mystery of their nature and of their difference from one another. I should however be heartily glad, were plagiarism the worst kind of dishonesty that denied German literature. There are others far more mischievous, which penetrate more deeply, and to which plagiarism bears the same proportion as picking pockets in a mild way to capital crime. I allude to that mean, despicable spirit, whose lodestar is personal interest, when it ought to be truth, and in which the voice of intention makes itself heard beneath the mask of insight. Double-dealing and time-serving are the order of the day. Tartuffe comedies are performed without rouge, nay, Capuchin sermons are preached in halls consecrated to science. Enlightenment, that once revered word, has become a term of opprobrium. The greatest thinkers of the past century, Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, Hume, are slandered, those heroes, ornaments and benefactors of mankind, whose fame, diffused throughout both hemispheres, can only be increased, if by anything, by the fact that wherever and whenever obscurantists show themselves, it is as their bitterest enemies, and with good reason. Literary coteries and associations are formed to deal out praise and blame, and spurious merit is then trumpeted forth and extolled, while sterling merit is slandered or, as Goethe says, secreted, by means of an inviolable silence, in which sort of inquisitorial censure the Germans have attained great proficiency. 1. The motives and considerations, however, from which all this proceeds, are of too low a nature for me to care to enumerate them in detail. But what a difference there is between periodicals such as the Edinburgh Review too, in which gentlemen of independent means are induced to write by a genuine interest in the subjects treated, and which honorably upholds its noble motto taken from Publius Cyrus, Judex damnator cum nocens absolvator. The judge is condemned when the guilty are acquitted, and our mean-spirited, disingenuous, German literary journals, full of considerations and intentions, that are mostly compiled for the sake of pay by hired editors and ought properly to have for their motto, Excitus socius laudis laudaris ut absens, be a friend and praise. When you're away we'll praise you. Now, after 20 years, do I understand what Goethe said to me at Berke in 1814. As I found him reading Madame de Staël's De l'Allemagne, on Germany, he remarked in course of conversation that she had given too exaggerated a description of German honesty and one that might mislead foreigners. He laughed and said, "Yes, to be sure, they will not secure their baggage behind and will have it cut off." He then added in a graver tone, "But one has to know German literature in order to realize the full extent of German dishonesty." All well and good. But the most revolting kind of dishonesty in German literature is that of the time-servers, who pass themselves off for philosophers, while in reality they are obscurantists. The word time-serving no more needs explanation than the thing needs a proof, for anyone who had the face to deny it would furnish strong evidence in support of my present argument. Kant taught that man ought to use his fellow man only as an end, never as a means. He did not think it necessary to say that philosophy ought only to be dealt with as an end, never as a means. Time-serving may after all be excused under every garb, the cowl as well as the ermine, save only the Tribonian, plain philosopher's cloak. For he who has once assumed this, has sworn allegiance to truth, and from that moment every other consideration, no matter of what kind, becomes base treachery. Therefore it was that Socrates did not shun the hemlock, nor Bruno the stake, while for a piece of bread these men will transgress. Are they too short-sighted to see posterity close at hand, with the history of philosophy at its side, recording 2 lines of bitter condemnation with unflinching hand and iron pen in its immortal pages? Or has this no sting for them? Well, to be sure, if it comes to the worst, après moi le déluge, after me the flood, may be pronounced, but as to après moi le mépris, after me scorn, that is a more difficult matter. Therefore I fancy they will answer that austere judge as follows: "Ah, dear posterity and history of philosophy, you are quite wrong to take us in earnest. We are not philosophers at all, heaven forbid. No, we are only professors of philosophy, mere servants of the state, mere philosophers in jest. You might as well drag puppet knights in pasteboard armor into a real tournament. Then the judge will most likely see how matters stand, erase all their names, and confer upon them the beneficium perpetui silentiae, benefit of eternal silence." From this digression to which I had been led away 18 years ago by the cant and time-serving I then witnessed, though they were not nearly as flourishing then as they are now, I return to that part of my doctrine which Dr. Brandes has confirmed, though he did not originate it, in order to add a few explanations with which I shall then connect some further corroborations it has since received from physiology. The 3 assumptions which are criticized by Kant in his transcendental dialectic under the names of ideas of reason, and have in consequence since been set aside in theoretical philosophy, had always stood in the way of a deeper insight into nature, until that great thinker brought about a complete transformation in philosophy. That supposed idea of reason, the soul, that metaphysical being in whose absolute singleness knowing and willing were knit and blended together to eternal, inseparable unity, was an impediment of this sort for the subject matter of this chapter. As long as it lasted, no philosophical physiology was possible. The less so, as its correlate, real, purely passive matter, had necessarily also to be assumed together with it, as the substance of the body. 1. It was this idea of reason, the soul, therefore, that caused the celebrated chemist and physiologist Stahl, at the beginning of the last century, to miss the discovery of the truth he so nearly approached and would have quite reached, had he been able to put that which is alone metaphysical, the bare will as yet without intellect, in the place of the anima rationalis, rational soul. Under the influence of this idea of reason, however, he could not teach anything but that it is this simple, rational soul which builds itself a body, all whose inner organic functions it directs and performs, yet has no knowledge or consciousness of all this, although knowledge is the fundamental destination and, as it were, the substance of its being. There was something absurd in this doctrine which made it utterly untenable. It was superseded by Haller's irritability and sensibility, which, to be sure, are taken in a purely impartial sense, but, to make up for this, are also 2 qualities occulti, occult qualities, at which all explanation ceases. The movement of the heart and of the intestines was now attributed to irritability. But the anima rationalis still remained in undiminished honor and dignity as a visitor at the house of the body. Truth lies at the bottom of a well, said Democritus, and the centuries with a sigh have repeated his words. But small wonder if it gets a rap on the knuckles as soon as it tries to come out. The fundamental truth of my doctrine, which places that doctrine in opposition with all others that have ever existed, is the complete separation between the will and the intellect, which all philosophers before me had looked upon as inseparable. Or rather, I ought to say that they had regarded the will as conditioned by, nay, mostly even as a mere function of the intellect, assumed by them to be the fundamental substance of our spiritual being. But this separation, this analysis into two heterogeneous elements, of the ego or soul, which had so long been deemed an indivisible unity, is, for philosophy, what the analysis of water has been for chemistry, though it may take time to be acknowledged. With me, that which is eternal and indestructible in man, therefore that which constitutes his vital principle, is not the soul, but if I may use a chemical term, its radical. And this is the will. The so-called soul is already a compound. It is the union of the will and the intellect, nu omicron upsilon. This intellect is the secondary element, the posterius of the organism, and, as a mere cerebral function, is conditioned by the organism, whereas the will is what is primary, the prius of the organism, which is conditioned by it. For the will is that essential being in itself, which only becomes apparent as an organic body in our representation. That mere function of the brain, it is only through the forms of knowledge, or cerebral function, that is, only in our representation, not apart from that representation, not immediately in our self-consciousness, that our body is given to each of us as a thing which has extension, limbs and organs. As the actions of our body are only acts of volition portraying themselves in representation, so likewise is their substratum, the shape of that body, in the main the portrait of the will, so that, in all the organic functions of our body, the will is just as much the agent as in its external actions. True physiology at its highest shows the spiritual, the intellectual, in man to be the product of the physical in him, and no one has done this so thoroughly as Cabanis. But true metaphysic teaches us that the physical in man is itself mere product, or rather phenomenon, of a spiritual, the will. Nay, that matter itself is conditioned by representation in which alone it exists. Perception and reflection will more and more find their explanation through the organism, but not the will, by which conversely the organism is explained, as I shall show in the following chapter. First of all, therefore, I place the will, as thing, in itself and quite primary. Secondly, its mere visibility, its objectification, i.e. the body. Thirdly, the intellect as a mere function of one part of that body. This part is itself the objectified will to know, the will to know having entered into representation, since the will needs knowledge to attain its own ends. Now the entire world is representation, together with the body itself therefore, inasmuch as it is a perceptible object, nay, matter in general as existing only in representation, all this, I say, is again conditioned by that function. For, duly considered, we cannot possibly conceive an objective world without a subject, in whose consciousness it is present. Thus knowledge and matter, subject and object, exist only relatively one for the other and constitute phenomenon. The whole thing therefore, owing to the radical change made by me, stands in a different light from that in which it has hitherto been regarded. As soon as it is directed outwardly and acts upon a recognized object, as soon therefore as it has passed through the medium of knowledge, we all recognize the will at once to be the active principle, and call it by its right name. Yet it is no less active in those inner processes which have preceded such outward actions as their conditions in those, for instance, which create and maintain organic life in its substratum, and the circulation of the blood, secretion, digestion, and see, are its work likewise. But just because the will was only recognized as the active principle in those cases in which it abandons the individual whence it proceeds, in order to direct itself towards the outer world now presenting itself as perception precisely for this end, knowledge has been taken for its essential condition, its sole element, nay, as the substance of which it consists, and hereby was perpetrated the greatest hysteron proteron that has ever been. But before all things we must learn to distinguish will, voluntas, from free will, wilker, arbitrium, and to understand that the former can subsist without the latter. This however presupposes my whole philosophy. The will is called free will when it is illumined by knowledge, therefore when the causes which move it are motives, that is, representations. Objectively speaking, this means, when the influence from outside which causes the act has a brain for its mediator. A motive may be defined as an external stimulus, whose action first of all causes an image to arise in the brain, through the medium of which the will carries out the effect proper, an outward action of the body. Now, in the human species however, the place of such an image as this may be taken by a concept drawn off from former images of this kind by dropping their differences, which concept consequently is no longer perceptible, but merely denoted and fixed by words. As the action of motives accordingly does not depend upon contact, they can try their power on the will against each other. In other words, they permit a certain choice which, in animals, is limited to the narrow sphere of that which has perceptible existence for them, whereas in man, its range comprises the vast extent of all that is thinkable, that is, of his concepts. Accordingly we designate as voluntary those movements which are occasioned, not by causes in the narrowest sense of the word, as in inorganic bodies, nor even by mere stimuli as in plants, but by motives. These motives however presuppose an intellect as their mediator, through which causality here acts, without prejudice to its entire necessity in all other respects. Physiologically, the difference between stimulus and motive admits also of the following definition. The stimulus provokes immediate reaction, which proceeds from the very part on which the stimulus has acted, whereas the motive is a stimulus that has to go a roundabout way through the brain, where its action first causes an image to arise, which then, but not till then, provokes the consequent reaction, which is now called an act of volition and voluntary. The distinction between voluntary and involuntary movement does not therefore concern what is essential and primary, for this is in both cases the will, but only what is secondary, the rousing of the will's manifestation. It has to do with the determination whether causes proper, stimuli, or motives, i.e. causes having passed through the medium of knowledge, are the guidance under which that manifestation takes place. It is in human consciousness, differing from that of animals by not only containing perceptible representations but also abstract concepts independent of time distinctions, which act simultaneously and collaterally, whereby deliberation, i.e. a conflict of motives, becomes possible. It is in human consciousness, I say, that free will, arbitrium, in its narrowest sense first makes its appearance, and this I have called elective decision. It nevertheless merely consists in the strongest motive for a given individual character overcoming the others and thus determining the act, just as an impact is overcome by a stronger counter-impact, the result thus ensuing with precisely the same necessity as the movement of a stone that has been struck. That all great thinkers in all ages were decided and at one on this point, is just as certain, as that the multitude will never understand, never grasp the important truth, that the work of our freedom must not be sought in our individual actions but in our very existence and nature itself. In my prize essay on the freedom of the will, I have shown this as clearly as possible. The liberum arbitrium indifferentia, free decision of the will, not influenced in any direction, which is assumed to be the distinctive characteristic of movements proceeding from the will, is accordingly quite inadmissible, for it asserts that effects are possible without causes. As soon therefore as we have got so far as to distinguish will from free will, willker, and to consider the latter as a particular kind or particular phenomenon of the former, we shall find no difficulty in recognizing the will, even in unconscious processes. Thus the assertion that all bodily movements, even those which are purely vegetative and organic, proceed from the will, by no means implies that they are voluntary. For that would mean that they were occasioned by motives. But motives are representations and their seat is the brain. Only those parts of our body which communicate with the brain by means of the nerves, can be put in movement by the brain, consequently by motives, and this movement alone is what is called voluntary. The movement of the inner economy of the organism, on the contrary, is directed, as in plant life, by stimuli, only as, on the one hand, the complex nature of the animal organism necessitated an outer sensorium for the apprehension of the outer world and the will's reaction to that outer world, so, on the other hand, did it necessitate a cerebrum abdominal, network of nerves in the stomach, the sympathetic nervous system, in order to direct the will's reaction likewise to inner stimuli. We may compare the former to a foreign office, the latter to a home ministry, but the will remains the omnipresent autocrat. The progress made in physiology since von Haller has placed beyond doubt the fact that not only those actions which are consciously performed, functions animals, but even vital processes that take place quite unconsciously, functions vitales et naturales, are directed throughout by the nervous system. Likewise that their only difference, as far as our consciousness of them is concerned, consists in the former being directed by nerves proceeding from the brain, the latter by nerves that do not directly communicate with that chief center of the nervous system, which is mainly directed towards the outside, but with subordinate, minor centers with the nerve knots, the ganglia and their network, which preside as it were like governors over the various provinces of the nervous system, directing. Those internal processes that follow upon internal stimuli, just as the brain directs the external actions that follow upon external motives, and thus receiving impressions from inside upon which they react correspondingly, just as the brain receives representations on the strength of which it forms resolutions. Only each of these minor centers is confined to a narrower sphere of action. Upon this rests the vita propria, proper life, of each system, in referring to which Van Helmont said that each organ has, as it were, its own ego. It accounts also for life continuing in parts which have been cut off the bodies of insects, reptiles and other inferior animals, whose brain has no marked preponderance over the ganglia of single parts, and it likewise explains how many reptiles are able to live for weeks, nay even months, after their brain has been removed. Now, if our surest experience teaches us that the will, which is known to us in most immediate consciousness and in a totally different way from the outer world, is the real agent in actions attended by consciousness and directed by the chief center of the nervous system, how can we help admitting that those other actions which, proceeding from that nervous system but obeying the direction of its subordinate centers, keep the vital processes constantly going, must also be manifestations of the will, especially as we know perfectly well the cause because of which they are not, like the others, attended by consciousness. We know, that is to say, that all consciousness resides in the brain and therefore is limited to such parts as have nerves which communicate directly with the brain, and we know also that, even in these, consciousness ceases when those nerves are severed. By this the difference between all that is conscious and unconscious and together with it the difference between all that is voluntary and involuntary in the movements of the body is perfectly explained, and no reason remains for assuming two entirely different primary sources of movement, especially as principia praeter necessitatem non sunt multiplicanda. Principles are not to be increased unnecessarily. All this is so obvious that, on impartial reflection from this standpoint, it seems almost absurd to persist in making the body serve two masters by deriving its actions from two radically different origins and then ascribing on the one hand the movements of our arms and legs, of our eyes, lips, throat, tongue and lungs, of the facial and abdominal muscles, to the will, while on the other hand the action of the heart, the movements of the veins, the peristaltic movements of the intestines, the absorption by the intestinal villi and glands and all those movements which accompany secretion, are supposed to proceed from a totally different, ever mysterious principle of which we have no knowledge, and which is designated by names such as vitality, archeus, spiritus animals, vital energy, instinct, all of which mean no more than X. 1. It is curious and instructive to see the trouble that excellent writer Treviranus takes, to find out in the lower animals such as infusoria and zoophyta, which movements are voluntary, and which are what he calls automatic or physical, i.e. merely vital. He founds his inquiry upon the assumption that he has to do with two primarily different sources of movement, whereas in truth they all proceed from the will, and the whole difference consists in their being occasioned by stimuli or by motives, i.e. in their having a brain for their medium or not, and the stimulus may again be merely interior or exterior. In several animals of a higher order, crustaceans and even fishes, he finds that the voluntary and vital movements, for instance locomotion and respiration, entirely coincide, a clear proof that their origin and essence are identical. He says on page 188, in the family of the actinia, starfishes, sea urchins and holothurus, Echinodermata pedata cov. It is evident that the movement of the fluids depends upon the will of the animals and that it is a means of locomotion. Then again on page 288, the gullet of mammals has at its upper end the pharynx, which expands and contracts by means of muscles resembling voluntary muscles in their formation, yet which do not obey the will. Here we see how the limits of the movements proceeding from the will and of those assumed to be foreign to it, merge into one another. Ibid, page 293, thus movements having all the appearance of being voluntary take place in the stomachs of ruminants. They do not, however, always stand in connection with the ruminating process only. Even the simpler human stomach and that of many animals only allows free passage to what is digestible through its lower orifice, and rejects what is indigestible by vomiting. There is moreover special evidence that the movements induced by stimuli, involuntary movements, proceed from the will just as well as those occasioned by motives, voluntary movements for instance, when the same movement follows now upon a stimulus, now again upon a motive, as is the case when the pupil of the eye is contracted. This movement, when caused by increased light, follows upon a stimulus, whereas when occasioned by the wish to examine a very small object minutely in close proximity, it follows upon a motive, because contracting the pupil enables us to see things distinctly even when quite near to us, and this distinctness may be increased by our looking through a hole pierced in a card with a pin. Conversely, the pupil is dilated when we look at distant objects. Surely the same movement of the same organ is not likely to proceed alternately from two fundamentally different sources. Weber relates that he discovered in himself the power of dilating and contracting at will the pupil of one of his eyes, while looking at the same object, so as to make that object appear now distinct, now indistinct, while the other eye remained closed. Johannes Müller also tries to prove that the will acts upon the pupil. The truth that the innermost mainspring of unconsciously performed vital and vegetative functions is the will, we find moreover confirmed by the consideration that even the movement of a limb, recognized as voluntary, is only the ultimate result of a multitude of preceding changes which have taken place inside that limb and which no more enter into our consciousness than those organic functions. Yet these changes are evidently that which was first set in motion by the will, the movement of the limb being merely their remote consequence. Nevertheless, this remains so foreign to our consciousness that physiologists try to reach it by means of such hypotheses as these: that the sinews and muscular fiber are contracted by a change in the cellular tissue wrought by a precipitation of the blood vapor in that tissue to serum, but that this change is brought about by the nerve's action and this by the will. Thus, even here, it is not the change which proceeded originally from the will which comes into consciousness, but only its remote result. And even this, properly speaking, only through the special perception of the brain in which it presents itself together with the whole organism. Now, by following the path of experimental research and hypotheses, physiologists would never have arrived at the truth that the last link in this ascending causal series is the will. It is known to them, on the contrary, in quite a different way. The solution of the enigma comes to them in a whisper from outside the investigation, owing to the fortunate circumstance that the investigator is in this case at the same time himself the object of the investigation, and by this learns the secret of the inward process, his explanation of which would otherwise, like that of every other phenomenon, be brought to a standstill by an inscrutable force. And conversely, if we stood in the same inward relation towards every natural phenomenon as towards our own organism, the explanation of every natural phenomenon, as well as of all the properties of every body, would likewise ultimately be reduced to a will manifesting itself in them. For the difference does not reside in the thing itself, but in our relation to the thing. Wherever explanation of the physical comes to an end, it is met by the metaphysical, and wherever this last is accessible to immediate knowledge, the result will be, as here, the will. That even those parts of the body whose movements do not proceed from the brain, do not follow upon motives and are not voluntary, are nevertheless ruled and animated by the will, is also shown by their participation in all unusually violent movements of the will, i.e. emotions and passions. We see, for instance, the quickened pulse in joy or alarm, the blush in embarrassment, the cheek's pallor in terror or in suppressed anger, the tears of sorrow, the difficult breathing and increased activity of the intestines in terror, watering of the mouth at the sight of dainties, nausea occasioned by that of loathsome objects, strongly accelerated circulation of the blood and even altered quality of bile through wrath, and of saliva through violent rage, this last even to the degree that an excessively irritated dog may communicate hydrophobia by its bite without being itself affected with rabies or even then contracting the disease, and the same is also asserted of cats and of cocks. The organism is further deeply undermined by lasting grief, and may be mortally affected by fright as well as by sudden joy. On the other hand, all those inner processes and changes which only have to do with the intellect and do not concern the will, however great may be their importance, remain without influence upon the machinery of the organism, with the one exception, that mental activity, prolonged to excess, fatigues and gradually exhausts the brain and finally undermines the organism. This again confirms the fact that the intellect is of a secondary character, and merely the organic function of a single part, a product of life, not the innermost kernel of our being, not the thing, in oi itself, not metaphysical, incorporeal, eternal like the will. The will never tires, never grows old, never learns, never improves by practice, is in infancy what it is in old age, eternally one and the same, and its character in each individual is unchangeable. Being essential moreover, it is likewise immutable, and therefore exists in animals as it does in us. For it does not, like the intellect, depend upon the perfection of the organization, but is in every essential respect in all animals the same thing which we know so intimately. Accordingly, animals have all the feelings which belong to man: joy, grief, fear, anger, love, hate, desire, envy, and see. The great difference between man and the brute creation consists exclusively in the degrees of perfection of the intellect. This, however, is leading us too far from our subject, so I refer my readers to my chief work, Volume 2, Chapter 19, Fact 2. After the cogent reasons just given in favor of the primary agent and the inward machinery of the organism being the very same will which rules the outward actions of the body and only reveals itself as the will in this passage through consciousness because here it needs the mediation of outwardly directed knowledge, we shall not be astonished to find that other physiologists besides Brandis had, by means of strictly empirical research, also recognized this truth more or less clearly. Meckel, one in his Archiv für die Physiologie, arrives quite empirically and impartially at the conclusion that vegetative existence, in animals, the first growth of the embryo, the assimilation of nourishment and plant life, ought properly to be considered as manifestations of the will, nay, that even the inclination of the magnetic needle seems to be something of the same kind. The assumption, he says, of a certain free will in every vital movement may perhaps be justified. Plants appear to seek light voluntarily, and see. This book is dated 1819 just after the appearance of my work, and as, to say the least, it is doubtful whether it had any influence upon him or whether he was even aware of its existence. I class these utterances among the independent empirical confirmations of my doctrine. Burdach also, too, in his great work on physiology, arrives by a completely empirical road at the conclusion that self-love is a force belonging to all things indiscriminately. He points it out, first in animals, then in plants and lastly in inanimate bodies. But what is self-love after all, if not the will to preserve our existence, the will to live? Under the heading Comparative Anatomy, I shall quote a passage from the same book, which confirms my view still more decidedly. That the doctrine, which teaches that the will is the vital principle, has begun to spread even to the wider circles of medical science and to meet with a favorable reception from its younger representatives, I notice with particular pleasure in the thesis sustained by Dr. von Seigers on taking his degree at Munich, August 1835, which commence as follows. 1. Sanguis est determinans formum organismi esse evolventis. 2. Evolutio organica determinator vitae interni action et voluntate. It is the blood that determines the form of the self-developing organism. Organic development is determined by the activity of the internal life and by the will. Lastly, a very remarkable and unexpected corroboration of this part of my doctrine has to be mentioned, which has recently been communicated from ancient Hindu philosophy by Colebrooke. In his exposition of the philosophical schools of the Hindus, he quotes the following as the doctrine of the Jnana school: volition, yatna, effort or manifestation of the will, is a self-determination to act which gives satisfaction. Desire is its occasion, perception its motive. Two kinds of perceptible effort of the will are distinguished: that which springs from desire which seeks the agreeable, and that which springs from aversion which shuns the repulsive. Another species, which escapes sensation and perception, but is inferred from analogy of spontaneous acts, comprises animal functions, having for a cause the vital, unseen power. Here the words animal functions are evidently used not in a physiological but in a popular sense, so that here organic life is unquestionably derived from the will. We find a similar statement in Colebrooke's report on the Vedas where he says, ASU is unconscious volition, which occasions an act necessary to the support of life as breathing etc. Moreover, my reduction of vital energy to the will by no means interferes with the old division of its functions into reproductive force, irritability and sensibility. This division remains a deep view of their difference, and gives occasion for interesting observations. The faculty of reproduction, objectified in the cellular tissue of plants, constitutes the chief characteristic of plants and the vegetative element in man. Where we find it predominant to excess in human beings, we assume them to be phlegmatic, dull, indolent, obtuse, Boeotians. Though this assumption does not always meet with confirmation. Irritability, objectified in the muscular tissue, constitutes the chief characteristic of animals and the animal element in man. Where it predominates to excess, dexterity, strength, bravery, that is, fitness for bodily exertion and for war, is usually to be found, Spartans. Nearly all warm-blooded animals and even insects far surpass man in irritability. It is by irritability that animals are most vividly conscious of their existence, wherefore they exult in manifesting it. There is even still a trace of that exultation perceptible in man, in dancing. Sensibility, objectified in the nerves, is man's chief characteristic, and constitutes what is properly human in him. In this no animal can in the remotest degree compare with man. Where it predominates to excess, it produces genius, Athenians. Accordingly, a man of genius is in a higher degree a man. This explains why some men of genius have been unwilling to recognize other men, with their monotonous physiognomies and universal stamp of commonplace mediocrity, as human beings. For in them they did not find their equals and naturally came to the erroneous conclusion that their own was the normal standard. Diogenes sought for men with a lantern in this sense. In that work of genius, the Koheleth Ecclesiastes, it is said, "One man among 1,000 have I found, but one woman among all those have I not found." And Gratian in his Criticon, the critic, perhaps the grandest and most beautiful allegory ever written, says, "But what was strangest of all, in the whole country, even in the most populous cities, they did not meet with a single man. On the contrary, these cities were inhabited by lions, tigers, leopards, wolves, foxes, apes, oxen, asses, pigs. Nowhere was there a man." They only made out after a time that the few existing human beings, in order to hide themselves and not to witness what was going on, had retired to those desert places which ought to have been the dwellings of wild beasts. The same reason indeed accounts for the peculiar inclination of all men of genius for solitude, to which they are driven by their difference from the rest, and for which their own inner wealth qualifies them. For, with humanity it is as with diamonds, the extraordinarily great ones alone are fitted to be solitaires, while those of ordinary size have to be set in clusters to produce any effect. Even the three gunas, or fundamental qualities of the Hindus, tally with the three physiological fundamental forces. Tamas guna, obtuseness, stupidity, corresponds to reproductive power, Rajas guna, passionateness, to irritability, and Sattva guna, wisdom and virtue, to sensibility. When, however, they add to this, that Tamas guna is the fate of animals, Rajas guna the fate of man, and Sattva guna that of the gods, this is to be taken in a mythological, rather than physiological sense. In chapter 20th of the second volume of my chief work entitled, Objectification of the Will in the Animal Organism, I have likewise treated the argument of the present chapter. Therefore I advise my readers to read it after this, as a complement to what is here given. Linguistic. All that I have to record under this head is an observation of my own, made within the last few years, which seems hitherto to have escaped notice. Yet, that it is worthy of consideration, is attested by Seneca's utterance. In certain matters, there is a wonderful propriety of words, and the usage of ancient speech marks certain things with most effective signs. Lichtenberg too says, "If one thinks much oneself, one finds a good deal of wisdom deposited in language. It is hardly likely that we have laid it all there ourselves, but rather that a great deal of wisdom really lies there. In many, perhaps in all languages, the action even of those bodies which are without intellect, nay of inanimate bodies, is expressed by the words to will, so that the existence of a will in these bodies is thus taken for granted, but they are never credited with a faculty for knowing, representing, perceiving or thinking. I know of no expression which conveys this." Seneca, when speaking of lightning shot down from heaven, says, "With these fires, it happens as it does with trees, whose tops, if they are supple, can be drawn down so far as to touch the ground, but when you let go, they spring back to their proper place. Therefore you should not judge the condition of anything by a state which is not according to its will. If you allow fire to go where it wishes, it will seek the heavens again." In a more general sense Pliny says, "In no part of nature should we look for a reason, but rather for a will." Nor do we find Greek less fertile in instances. Aristotle, when explaining gravity, says, "A small part of the earth, if lifted up and let go, is carried away, downward, and does not wish to remain where it was." And, one ought to say that each thing is that which it wills to be by its own nature, and that which it is in truth, but not that which it is by force and contrary to its nature. Of great and more than merely linguistic importance is what Aristotle says in his Ethica Magna, where not only animals, but inanimate beings, fire striving upwards and earth downwards, are explicitly in question, and he asserts that they may be obliged to do something contrary to their nature or their will, to do something contrary to nature or contrary to what they will. Anacreon, in his 29th Ode, Epsilon Beta Theta Upsilon Lambda Lambda Omicron Nu, in ordering the portrait of his ladylove, says of her hair, "Joining the curls of her hair loosely and without order, let them lie as they will." In German, Berger says, "Hinab will der Bach nicht hinnen," the brook will go downwards not upwards. In daily life we constantly hear, "The water boils, it will run over, the glass will break, the ladder will not stand, le feu ne veut pas brûler," the fire does not want to burn, the fire does not want to burn. La corde, une fois tordue, veut toujours s'y retordre. The rope, once twisted, always wants to untwist itself. In English, the verb to will is even the auxiliary of the future of all the other verbs, thus expressing the notion that there lies a will at the bottom of every action. In English, moreover, the endeavors of all inanimate and unconscious things are expressly designated by the word want, which denotes every sort of human desire or endeavor. The water wants to get out, the steam wants to make itself way through Schopenhauer's English. In Italian too we have vol piovere, it will rain, quest, orologio non vol an. Oh, this clock will not go. The conception of willing is besides so deeply rooted in this last language, that it seems to indicate everything that is requisite or necessary. 6 vol un contrapeso, it wants a counterweight. 6 vol pazienza, it wants patience. A very striking instance of this is to be found even in Chinese, a language which differs fundamentally from all those belonging to the Sanskrit family. It is in the commentary to the Weiqing I Ching, one accurately rendered by Pater Regis as follows: Yang, seu materia celestis, vult versus ingredi vel ut verbis doctoris ching, teuter, vult versus esse in superior loco, silicet ilius naturi ratio ita fert seu in ada lex. The yang or celestial substance wants to return to heaven or, to use the words of the teacher Ching, Tse, wants to occupy again a superior place, because its nature necessarily entails this or a law inherent in it. The following passage from Justice Liebig has decidedly much more than a linguistic signification, for it expresses an intimate feeling and comprehension of the way in which a chemical process takes place. Aldehyde arises, which with the same avidity as sulfurous acid, combines directly with oxygen to form acetic acid. And again, aldehyde, which absorbs oxygen from the air with great avidity. As Liebig uses this expression twice in speaking of the same phenomenon, it can hardly be by chance, but rather because it was the only adequate expression for the thing. Sinology. Nothing perhaps points more directly to a high degree of civilization in China than the almost incredible density of its population, now rated, according to Gutzlaff, at 367 millions of inhabitants. One for whether we compare countries or ages, we find on the whole that civilization keeps pace with population. The pertinacious zeal with which the Jesuit missionaries of the 17th and 18th centuries strove to inculcate their own relatively new doctrines into the minds of this very ancient nation, and their futile endeavors to discover early traces of their own faith in that country, left them no time for a profound study of the belief which prevails there. Therefore Europe has only lately obtained some slight knowledge of the religious state of the Chinese. We now know, that is to say, that in China there exists first of all a worship of nature, which is universally professed and dates from the earliest times, even, it is alleged, from before the discovery of fire, wherefore animals were sacrificed raw. The sacrifices offered up publicly at certain seasons or after great events by the Chinese emperor and the chief dignitaries of the empire, belong to this worship. These sacrifices are dedicated first and foremost to the blue sky and to the earth, the former to the blue sky in the winter solstice, the latter to the earth in the summer solstice, and after these, to every possible power of nature: the sea, mountains, rivers, winds, thunder, rain, fire, and sea. A genius presides over each of these, and each genius has several temples. On the other hand, each genius presiding over every single province, town, village, or street, nay over family funerals and even sometimes over a merchant's warehouse, has also temples. Only in the two last cases they are destined exclusively for private worship. But public worship is besides offered up to former illustrious emperors, founders of dynasties, and to heroes, i.e. to all such as have benefited Chinese mankind by word or deed. Even these have their temples, Confucius alone having no less than 1,650 dedicated to him. This therefore accounts for the great number of small temples found throughout the empire. With this hero worship too, is associated the private worship offered up by every respectable family on the tombs of their ancestors. Now besides this worship of nature and of heroes, which is universal, there are three other prevailing religious doctrines in China, more with a dogmatical intent. First among these is the doctrine of Taoshi, founded by Lao Tse, an older contemporary of Confucius. This is the doctrine of reason, of Vernunft, as the inner order of the universe or inherent principle of all things, of the Great One, the sublime gable beam or roof, tree, Taiki, which supports all the rafters, yet is above them, properly the all-pervading soul of the world, and of Tao, i.e. the way, namely to salvation, that is, to redemption from the world and its misery. We have an exposition of this doctrine taken from the fountainhead in Stanislas Julien's translation, 1842, of Lot's Teoteking, in which we find that the Tao doctrine completely harmonizes with Buddhism both in meaning and in spirit. This sect, however, seems to have fallen very much into the background, and its teachers to be now looked down upon. Secondly, we find the wisdom of Confucius, which has special attractions for Chinese savants and statesmen. Judging from translations, it is a rambling, commonplace, predominantly political, moral philosophy, without any metaphysical support, which has something peculiarly insipid and tiresome about it. Finally, there exists for the bulk of the nation Buddha's sublime doctrine full of love. The name or rather title of Buddha in China is Fo or Fu, whilst in Tartary the victoriously perfect is more frequently called by his family name Shakyamuni and also Birkin Bakshi. In Burma and Ceylon he is generally called Gautama or Tathagata, but his original name was Prince Siddhartha. This religion, which on account of its intrinsic excellence and truth as well as of the great number of its followers, may be considered as ranking highest among all religions on earth, prevails throughout the greater part of Asia, and according to the latest investigator, Robert Spence Hardy numbers 369 millions of believers. That is, far more than any other. These three religions, the most widely diffused of which, Buddhism, subsists without any protection whatever from the state, by its own power alone, a circumstance which speaks greatly in its favor, are far from being hostile to one another, and exist quietly side by side, nay, harmonize even to a certain extent, perhaps by reciprocal influence, so that the sentence, "The three doctrines are only one," has become proverbial. The emperor, as such, professes all three. Still many of the emperors, even up to the most recent times, have been especially devoted to Buddhism. This is shown by their profound respect for the Dalai Lama, nay, even for the Tesha Lama, to whom they unhesitatingly yield precedence. These three religions are neither monotheistic nor polytheistic, nor are they even pantheistic. Buddhism at any rate is not, since Buddha did not look upon a world sunk in sin and suffering whose tenets, all subject to death, only subsist for a short time by devouring each other, as a manifestation of God. Moreover, the word pantheism, properly speaking, contains a contradiction, for it denotes a self-destroying conception, and has therefore never been understood otherwise than as a polite term of expression by those who know what seriousness means. It accordingly never entered into the heads of the clever, acute philosophers of the 18th century, not to take Spinoza for an atheist, on account of his having called the world Deus. On the contrary, this discovery was reserved for the sham philosophers of our own times, who know nothing but words. They even pique themselves on the achievement and accordingly talk about a cosmism, the wags. But I would humbly suggest leaving their meanings to words in short, calling the world, and gods, gods. In their endeavors to acquire knowledge of the state of religion in China, Europeans began as usual, and as the Greeks and Romans under similar circumstances had done, by first searching for points of contact with their own belief. Now as, in their own way of thinking, the conceptions of religion and of theism were almost identified, or at any rate had grown together so closely, that they could only be separated with great difficulty. As moreover, till a more accurate knowledge of Asia had reached Europe, the very erroneous opinion had been disseminated for the purpose of argument e consensu gentium, from the agreement of nations, that all nations on earth worship a single, or at any rate a highest, God, creator of the universe. When they found themselves in a country where temples, priests and monasteries abounded, they started from the firm assumption that theism would also be found there, though in some very unusual form. On seeing these expectations disappointed, however, and on finding that the very conceptions of such things, let alone the words to express them, were unknown, it was but natural, considering the spirit in which their inquiries were made, that their first reports of these religions should refer rather to what they did not, than to what they did contain. Besides, for many reasons, it can be no easy task for European heads to enter fully into the sense of these faiths. In the first place, they are brought up in optimism, whereas in Asia, existence itself is looked upon as an evil and the world as a scene of misery, where it were better not to find oneself. Another reason is to be found in the decided idealism which is essential to Buddhism and to Hinduism, a view only known in Europe as a paradox hardly worth a serious thought, advanced by certain eccentric philosophers, whereas in Asia it is even embodied in popular belief. For in Hindustan it prevails universally as the doctrine of Maya, and in Tibet, the chief seat of the Buddhist church, it is taught in an extremely popular way, a religious comedy being performed on occasions of special solemnity, in which the Dalai Lama is represented arguing with the archfiend. The former defends idealism, the latter realism, and among other things the devil says, "What is perceived through the five sources of all knowledge, the senses, is no deception, and what you teach is not true." After a long argumentation the matter is decided by a throw of the dice. The realist, the devil, loses and is dismissed amid general jeering. One keeping this fundamental difference in the whole way of thinking steadily in view, we shall find it not only excusable, but even natural, that in their investigation of the Asiatic religions Europeans should at first have stopped short at the negative standpoint. Though, properly speaking, it has nothing to do with the matter. We therefore find a great deal referring to this negative standpoint which in no way advances our positive knowledge. It all however amounts to this: that monotheism, an exclusively Jewish doctrine, to be sure is alien to Buddhists and in general to the Chinese. For instance, in the Lettres Edifiantes 2 we find, the Buddhists whose views on the migration of souls are universally adopted, are accused of atheism. In the Asiatic Researches, Volume 6, page 255, we find, the religion of the Burmese, Buddhism, shows them to be a nation far advanced beyond the barbarism of a wild state and greatly influenced by religious opinions, but which nevertheless has no knowledge of a supreme being, creator and preserver of the world. Yet the system of morality recommended in their fables is perhaps as good as any other taught by the religious doctrines which prevail among mankind. And again, page 258, the followers of Gautama, i.e. of Buddha, are, strictly speaking, atheists. Ibid, page 258, Gautama's sect consider the belief in a divine being, creator of the world, to be highly irreligious, impious. Ibid, page 268, Buchanan relates that actually the Zarato or high priest of the Buddhists at Ava, in an article upon his religion which he presented to a Catholic bishop, counted the doctrine, that there is a being who has created the world and all things in it and is alone worthy of adoration, among the 6 damnable heresies. Sangermano relates precisely the same thing. One encloses the list of the 6 grave heresies with the words, "The last of these impostors taught, that there is a supreme being, the creator of the world and of all things in it, and that he alone is worthy of adoration." Colebrook too says, 2. The sects of Jaina and Buddha are really atheistic, for they acknowledge no creator of the world, nor any supreme ruling providence. I. J. Schmidt 3 likewise says, the system of Buddhism knows no eternal, uncreated, single, divine being, having existed before all time, who has created all that is visible and invisible. This idea is quite foreign to Buddhism and there is not the slightest trace of it anywhere in Buddhistic books. We find the learned sinologist Morrison too not less desirous to discover traces of a god in the Chinese dogmas and ready to put the most favorable construction upon everything which seems to point in that direction. Yet he is finally obliged to own that nothing of the kind can be clearly discovered. Where he explains the words thung and tsing, i.e. repose and movement, as that on which Chinese cosmogony is based, he renews this inquiry and concludes it with the words, "It is perhaps impossible to acquit this system of the accusation of atheism." And even recently Upham says, Buddhism presents to us a world without a moral ruler, guide or creator. The German sinologist Newman too, says in his treatise mentioned further on, in China where neither Mohammedans nor Christians found a Chinese word to express the theological conception of the deity. The words God, soul, spirit, as independent of matter and ruling it arbitrarily, are utterly unknown in the Chinese language. This range of ideas has become so completely one with the language itself, that the first verse of the Book of Genesis cannot without considerable circumlocution be translated into genuine Chinese. It was this very thing that led Sir George Staunton to publish a book in 1848 entitled, An Inquiry into the Proper Mode of Rendering the Word God and Translating the Sacred Scriptures into the Chinese Language. My intention in giving the above quotations and explanations is merely to prepare the way for the extremely remarkable passage, which it is the object of the present chapter to communicate, and to render that passage more intelligible to the reader by first making him realize the standpoint from which these investigations were made, and thus throwing light upon the relation between them and their subject. For Europeans, when investigating this matter in China in the way and in the spirit described, always inquiring for the supreme principle of all things, the power that rules the world and see, had often been referred to that which is designated by the word Tian English, thine. Now, the more usual meaning of this word is heaven, as Morrison also says in his dictionary, still it is a well-known thing that Tian is used in a figurative sense also, and then has a metaphysical signification. In the Lettres Edifiantes L we find the following explanation. Hing Tian is the material, visible heaven, Chin Tian the spiritual and invisible heaven. Sonorat too, in his travels in East India and China, says, when the Jesuits disputed with the rest of the missionaries as to the meaning of the word Tian, whether it was heaven or God, the Chinese looked upon these foreigners as restless folk and drove them away to Macau. It was at any rate through this word that Europeans could first hope to find the track of that analogy of Chinese metaphysic with their own faith, which had been so persistently sought for, and it was doubtless owing to investigations of this kind that the results we find communicated in an essay entitled Chinese Theory of the Creation were attained. One as to Chu Fuzi, called also Chu Hai, who is mentioned in it, I observe that he lived in the 12th century according to our chronology, and that he is the most celebrated of all the Chinese men of learning because he has collected together all the wisdom of his predecessors and reduced it to a system. His work is in our days the basis of all Chinese instruction, and his authority of the greatest weight. In the passage I allude to we find, the word teen would seem to denote the highest among the great or above all what is great on earth, but in practice its vagueness of signification is beyond all comparison greater than that of the term heaven in European languages. Chu Fuzi tells us that, to affirm that heaven has a man, i.e. a sapient being, there to judge and determine crimes, should not by any means be said, nor on the other hand must it be affirmed, that there is nothing at all to exercise a supreme control over these things. The same author being asked about the heart of heaven, whether it was intelligent or not, answered, "It must not be said that the mind of nature is unintelligent, but it does not resemble the cogitations of man." According to one of their authorities, teen is called ruler or sovereign, Chu, from the idea of the supreme control, and another expresses himself thus, "Had heaven, teen, no designing mind, then it must happen, that the cow might bring forth a horse, and on the peach tree be produced the blossom of the pear." On the other hand it is said, that the mind of heaven is deducible from what is the will of mankind. The agreement between this last sentence and my doctrine is so striking and so astonishing, that if this passage had not been printed full 8 years after my own work had appeared, I should no doubt have been accused of having taken my fundamental thought from it. For there are 3 well-known modes of repelling the attack of new thoughts. Firstly, by ignoring them, secondly by denying them, and lastly by asserting that they are not new, but were known long before. But the fact that my fundamental thought was formed quite independently of this Chinese authority, is firmly established by the reasons I have given, for I may hope to be believed when I affirm, that I am unacquainted with the Chinese language and consequently unable to derive thoughts for my own use from original Chinese sources unknown to others. On further investigation I have elicited the fact, that the passage I have quoted, was most probably, nay almost certainly, taken from Morrison's Chinese dictionary, where it may be found under the sign teen. Only I have no opportunity of verifying it. In an article by Newman there are some passages which have evidently a common source with those here quoted from the Asiatic Journal. But they are written with the vagueness of expression which is so frequent in Germany, and excludes clear comprehension. Besides, this translator of Chuhai evidently did not himself quite understand the original, though by this no blame need be implied, when we consider the enormous difficulty of the Chinese language for Europeans, and the insufficiency of the means for studying it. Meanwhile it does not give us the enlightenment desired. We must therefore console ourselves with the hope, that as a freer intercourse with China has now been established, some Englishmen may one day give us more minute and thorough information concerning the above-mentioned dogma, of which we have hitherto received such deplorably imperfect accounts. Reference to ethics. For reasons I have stated in the beginning, confirmations of the rest of my doctrine are excluded from my present task. Still, in concluding, I may perhaps be allowed to make a general reference to ethics. From time immemorial, all nations have acknowledged that the world has a moral as well as a physical import. Everywhere nevertheless the matter was only brought to an indistinct consciousness, which, in seeking for its adequate expression, has clothed itself in various images and myths. These are the different religions. Philosophers, on their side, have at all times endeavored to attain clear comprehension of the thing and, notwithstanding their differences in other respects, all, excepting the strictly materialistic philosophical systems, agree in this one point, that what is most important, nay, alone essential in our whole existence, that on which everything depends, the real meaning, pivot or point, sit venia verbo, of it, lies in the morality of human actions. But as to the sense of this, as to the ways and means, as to the possibility of the thing, they all again quite disagree, and find themselves before an abyss of obscurity. Thus it follows that it is easy to preach but difficult to found morality. It is just because that point is determined by our conscience, that it becomes the touchstone of all systems, since we demand and rightly demand that metaphysics should give support to ethics. And now arises the difficult problem to show that, contrary to all experience, the physical order of things depends upon a moral one, and to find out a connection between the force which, by acting according to eternal laws of nature, gives the world stability, and the morality which has its seat in the human breast. This is therefore the rock on which the best thinkers have foundered. Spinoza occasionally tacks a moral theory on to his pantheistic fatalism by means of sophisms, but more often leaves morality terribly in the lurch. Kant, when theoretical reason is exhausted, sends his categorical imperative, laboriously worked out of mere conceptions, on the stage as deus ex machina, with an absolute ought. But the mistake he made by it only became quite clear when Fichte, who always took outbidding for outdoing, had spun it out with Christian Wolffian prolixity and wearisomeness to a complete system of moral fatalism in his System of Moral Doctrine, and subsequently presented it more briefly in his last pamphlet. Now, from this point of view, a system which places the reality of all existence and the root of the whole of nature in the will, and in this will places the root of the world, must undeniably carry with it, to say the least, a strong prejudice in its favor. For, by a direct and simple way, it reaches, nay, already holds in its hand before coming to ethics, what other systems try to reach by roundabout, ever dubious bypaths. Nor indeed can any other road ever lead to this but the insight, that the active and impulsive force in nature which presents this perceptible world to our intellect, is identical with the will within us. The only metaphysic which really and immediately supports ethics, is that one which is itself primarily ethical and constituted out of the material of ethics. Therefore I had a far greater right to call my metaphysic ethics, than Spinoza, with whom the word sounds almost like irony, and whose ethics might be said to bear the name like lucus a non lucendo, since it is only by means of sophistry that he has been able to tack his morality onto a system, from which it would never logically proceed. In general, moreover, he disavows it downright with revolting assurance. On the whole, I can confidently assert, that there has never yet been a philosophical system so entirely cut out of one piece, so completely without any joins or patches as mine. As I have said in my preface, it is the unfolding of a single thought, by which the ancient pi lambda omicron mu theta omicron tau lambda eta theta epsilon alpha phi upsilon is again confirmed. Then we must still take into consideration here, that freedom and responsibility, those pillars on which all morality rests, can certainly be asserted in words without the assumption of the aseity of the will, but that it is absolutely impossible to think them without it. Whoever wishes to dispute this, must first invalidate the axiom stated long ago by the schoolmen, operari sequitur esse, the acts of each being follow from the nature of that being, or we must demonstrate the fallacy of the inference to be drawn from it, unde esse inde operari. Responsibility has for its condition freedom, but freedom has for its condition primariness. For I will according to what I am, therefore I must be according to what I will. Aseity of the will is therefore the first condition of any ethics based on serious thought, and Spinoza is right when he says, Ea residential libera diciter, quae ex sola sui naturi necessitate existit, tia esse sola ad agendum determinator. Dependence, as to existence and nature, united with freedom as to action, is a contradiction. Were Prometheus to call the creatures of his making to account for their actions, they would be quite justified in answering, we could only act according to our being, for actions arise from nature. If our actions were bad, the fault lay in our nature. This is thine own work, punish thyself. And it is just the same with the imperishableness of our true being in death, for this cannot be seriously thought without the aseity of that being, and can even hardly be conceived without a fundamental separation of the will from the intellect. This last point is peculiar to my philosophy, but Aristotle had already proved the first thoroughly, by showing at length how that alone can be imperishable which has not arisen, and that the two conceptions condition each other. These things follow one another, that which is ungenerated is incorruptible, and that which is incorruptible is ungenerated. For the generated and the corruptible follow one another. If a thing is generated, it is necessarily corruptible. All those among the ancient philosophers who taught an immortality of the soul, understood it in this way, nor did it enter into the head of any of them to assign infinite permanence to a being having arisen in any way. We have evidence of the embarrassment to which the contrary assumption leads, in the ecclesiastical controversy between the advocates of pre-existence, creation and traduction. The optimism moreover of all philosophical systems is a point closely allied to ethics which must never fail in any of them as in duty bound, for the world likes to hear that it is commendable and excellent, and philosophers like to please the world. With me it is different. I have seen what pleases the world, and therefore shall not swerve a step from the path of truth in order to please it. Thus in this point also my system varies from all the others and stands by itself. But when all the others have completed their demonstrations to the song of the best of worlds, quite at the last, at the background of the system, like a tardy avenger of the monster, like a spirit from the tomb, like the statue in Don Juan, there comes the question as to the origin of evil, of the monstrous, nameless evil, of the awful, heartrending misery in the world. And here they are speechless or can only find words, empty, sonorous words, with which to settle this heavy reckoning. On the other hand, a system in whose basis already the existence of evil is interwoven with the existence of the world, need not fear that apparition any more than a vaccinated child need fear the smallpox. Now this is the case when freedom is placed in the esse instead of in the operari, and sin, evil and the world then proceed from that esse. Moreover, it is fair to let me, as a serious man, only speak of things which I really know and only make use of words to which I attach a quite definite meaning, since this alone can be communicated with security to others, and Vauvenargues is quite right in saying, La clarté est la bonne foi de philosophes. Therefore if I use the words, will to live, this is no mere ens rationis, no hypostasis set up by me, nor is it a term of vague, uncertain meaning. On the contrary, I refer him who asks what it is to his own inner self, where he will find it entire, nay, in colossal dimensions as a true ens realissimum. I have accordingly not explained the world out of the unknown, but rather out of that which is better known than anything, and known to us moreover in quite a different way from all the rest. As to the paradoxical character finally, with which the ascetic results of my ethics have been reproached, these results had given umbrage even to Jean Paul, otherwise so favorably disposed towards me, and had induced her Ratza also, not knowing that the only course to be adopted against me was silence, to write a book against me in 1820, with the best intentions. They have since become the standing rock of offense in my philosophy, but I beg my readers to take into consideration, that it is only in this northwestern portion of the ancient continent, and even here only in Protestant countries, that the term paradoxical can be applied to such things, whereas throughout the whole of vast Asia, everywhere indeed, where the detestable doctrine of Islam has not prevailed over the ancient and profound religions of mankind by dint of fire and sword, they would rather have to fear the reproach of being commonplace. I console myself therefore with the thought that, when referred to the Upanishads of the sacred Vedas, my ethics are quite orthodox, and that even with primitive, genuine Christianity they stand in no contradiction. As to all other accusations of heresy, I am well armored and my breast is fortified with triple steel. Conclusion. The undoubtedly striking confirmations recorded in this treatise, which have been contributed to my doctrine by the empirical sciences since its first appearance, but independently of it, will unquestionably have been followed by many more, for how small is the portion which the individual can find time, opportunity and patience to become acquainted with, of the branch of literature dedicated to natural science which is so actively cultivated in all languages. Even what I have here mentioned, however, inspires me with confidence that the time for my philosophy is ripening, and it is with heartfelt joy that I see the empirical sciences gradually come forward in the course of time, as witnesses above suspicion, to testify to the truth of a doctrine, concerning which a politic, inviolable silence has been maintained for 17 years by our philosophers by profession. Some of them give themselves this characteristic name, nay even that of philosophers by trade, so that it had been left to Jean Paul, who was ignorant of their tactics, to draw attention to it. For it may have appeared to them a delicate matter to praise it, and on due consideration, they may have thought it not altogether safe to blame it either, and may have judged it unnecessary besides to show the public, as belonging neither to the profession nor to the trade, that it is quite possible to philosophize very seriously without being either unintelligible or wearisome. Why compromise themselves therefore with it, since no one betrays himself by silence and the favorite secretive method was ready at hand, the approved specific against merit? This much was besides soon agreed upon, that, considering the circumstances of the times, my philosophy did not possess the right qualifications for being taught professionally. Now the true ultimate aim of all philosophy with them, is to be taught professionally, so much and so truly is it so, that were truth to come down stark naked from lofty Olympus, but were what she brought with her not found to correspond to the requirements called for by the circumstances of the times, or to the purposes of their mighty superiors, these gentlemen of the profession and trade would verily waste no time with the indecent nymph, but would hasten to bow her out again to her. Olympus then placed 3 fingers on their lips and returned quietly to their compendia. For assuredly he who makes love to this nude beauty, to this fascinating siren, to this portionless bride, will have to forego the good fortune of becoming a government and university professor. He may even congratulate himself if he becomes a garret philosopher. On the other hand, his audience will consist, not of hungry undergraduates anxious to turn their learning to account, but rather of those rare, select thinkers, thinly sprinkled among the countless multitude, who arise from time to time, almost as a freak of nature. And a grateful posterity is beckoning from afar. But they can have no idea of the beauty and loveliness of truth, of the delight there is in pursuing her track, of the rapture in possessing her, who can imagine that anyone who has once looked her in the face can ever desert, deny, or distort her for the sake of the venal approval, of the offices, of the money or the titles of such people. Better to grind spectacle glasses like Spinoza or draw water like Cleanthes. Henceforth they may take whatever course they like. Truth will not change her nature to accommodate the trade. Serious philosophy has now really outgrown universities, where science stands under state guardianship. It may however someday perhaps come to be counted among the occult sciences, while the spurious kind, that ancilla theologiae in universities, that inferior counterfeit of scholasticism, for which the highest criterion of philosophical truth lies in the country catechism, will make our lecture halls doubly re-echoed. You that way, we this way.